This is a Senior Life Academy located on the campus of the University Park United Methodist Church here in Dallas, Texas. Welcome. I'm Dee Dee Cassad, and with me on this panel is Miriam Mathis, Bob Monroe, Stephen Fleming, and our guest Marilyn Hodge. Today we have been asked to talk about the tithing of time and the priority of time in our life. Now that we are retired, and most of us have been retired for several years, how do we prioritize our time, not only for the good of the church, but as a spiritual discipline? Start us out, Stephen.
You know, there's certain values that we develop over our life. They come with what we hope is wisdom and maturity. And if we haven't given some thought to this before we retire, we're going to be kind of at a loss. But it should carry through with a consistency about what we have been thinking of about what we want to do when we retire, what our gifts have been, and what we've discovered over our years of employment or having a full nest or
Experience,
whatever. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Maybe what we haven't been able to utilize or explore that we think God might have been calling us to use our time to do.
But there's a certain sense in which all of us that, well, when we retire, we will do this, this, this. We will travel. We will, we'll buy a ranch and raise horses. A lot of people want to buy a ranch and raise horses. But my experience with that is that doesn't last very long. And it's not satisfying. The time is, we don't consider the time that we have as discretionary time when we're retired, but it is time that we can choose, is it not? How do you see it, Marion?
It's really kind of freeing, but you have to, as you said, give it some thought. I think that mainly people in the helping professions are so tired by the time they retire, whether it be preachers or teachers or, nurses or social workers. I've heard people say, and I think it's a good idea, you have priorities, but sometimes you have too many priorities when you get to the time when you retire. I could do this, and well, now I have time to do that, and think about, oh, wow, and I could volunteer here. And so somebody at this church said that her mother spent 6 months just thinking about it after she retired. She was changing gears, and she thought, okay, let me think about how I'm going to plan to use this time the way I can be of value to some other people, and the way I can also renew my own spirituality. Because I think when people retire, they think, okay, well, either one of two things. I've contributed all I can to the world. It's my turn to sit and watch all the back issues of, or all the back
Episodes of some
episodes
TV.
of some TV show. Yes, thank you. And
I do know people who sit and watch television every day.
Or okay, well, now I can really help out at the church, or now I can really get a second job and make some extra money. And you have to. The thing about that is your energy level has changed probably. So you got to factor that into.
Well, and there's some people who will say, I think Bob mentioned it at one other time, that their attitude is, I've been there, I've done that, somebody else can do it. Right. Now, how do we program that in thinking about how much time? If we tithe time, if we really look at it, if you tithe a day, 24 hours, that's 2 hours and 40 minutes a day. What do we do with that? Is that programmed in, or if we tithe our waking hours, say 8 hours, that's 80 minutes a day. We don't really do that. So how do we tithe our time realistically? And how do we prioritize that time? How do you do it, Marilyn?
Well, I was thinking when Mary Ann was talking, when
we retired. I retired at about the same time that my husband did, so that we could travel.
Mm-hmm.
So we bought a motorhome. And I guess my caution would be that don't be surprised if something happens to change your plans. Because we bought a motorhome when we were just going to travel
And see the world.
See the world. And we had taken some trips and cruises and still managed to. But about 2 weeks after we bought the motorhome, my mother-in-law had to move to Dallas because she could no longer care for herself.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Changed
we had
plans.
to put a few brakes on. But we were able to still work in things that we could do and that kind of thing. I guess probably the thing, and we were talking about managing your time, is that I think if you look at, do some self-analysis and say, okay, this is what I enjoyed doing before I retired. Could I continue to do that? Will I have enough time to do that? How much time am I going to need to spend with my family, or taking care of my home, or that kind of thing? Be careful to budget. And be careful to choose and pick what you're going to do.
Yes, and gifting time.
That's right.
You can gift some of your time, time that you might not have planned for, but certain things come up. Certain things come up in this church, and all of a sudden that we didn't know was coming, and they need something.
That's right.
And there are people here who rally to the cause. They do that. They answer the call. And I think there's a certain sense in which we ought to allow for that.
That's right.
And count that as part of our, if we are counting, count that as part of our gift to the church. And if we recall, and I've been thinking about this a lot, very few people really go back and think about the vow they took when they joined the church. But the first thing is their prayer life. In other words, you support it with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, and your service. So how do we then, if we looked at those four, how do we prioritize those in a sense of time?
Well, your presence, period, is
Right.
one thing. That's not ENTS, it's ENCES. And it's funny. You talked about those of us on this panel who are retired. I'm probably the most recently of the retirees. I tell people sometimes I'm still in recovery because I'm taking that 6 months and expanding on it to really. But I had no idea I was going to run into an unstoppable force like Didi Kassad, who wanted me to participate in this panel. And if you're not open to some,
you found you got caught in the sphere.
Well, if you're not open to some leadership of the Holy Spirit, you just may be locked into something that's not the right thing for you.
That's true.
I think I'm not just being trying to be funny about this. You just have to, like you say, you might plan to travel and find out you need to be taking care of somebody. And that may be what you're called to do. But if you're ironclad on, fixating on, I'm going to do this, you're approaching how to use the resource of time that God gives you in a way that isn't really in keeping with the values that you've had before, which is to use your time responsibly and let God provide some leadership there.
Right.
Well, and there's a sense in which I think, Bob, you have been you give a lot of time reading to children, and there's a sense in which the gifts that we had before we retired, we still possess. The experience that we had is unlike anybody else's, and that's a value that we can convey in many instances. So I don't think retirement is not a line drawn in the sand.
We are the same person. We may lose some energy. I agree to that. But we redesign our life according to who we are, our experience, our knowledge, and our self equipment to give to others.
And I think it's important to realize that, I mean, everybody knows this, but I don't think we really believe it half the time, that just because you retire doesn't mean you stop growing and learning, and spiritually in every other way. I mean, that's when people start taking salsa dancing classes and also
That's true.
learning to weave, or learning to code, or
Or learning Spanish,
Or
like
learn-
I'm doing right
There you
now.
are.
There you go.
I mean, I think that there's nothing wrong with that. And then I was just reading something recently that Parker Palmer wrote about becoming fierce in our aging, and where, because his thrust is social justice and changing communities, and he said that politically you might be retired, but you can still speak, and you still have opinions,
And you can vote.
and you can vote. So all of that matters a lot to the whole community, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when before I retired, I was usually doing some things in church, like being on committees or something like that. And I felt that was probably more a duty that I should, do those things. And when I retired, my health was very good, so I worked full-time for Habitat for Humanity, 1 day a week, but all year round. I did that in Fort Worth and Dallas. And there was a great sense of accomplishment because you can see something you're building, and you're working with teams, and you see the people who have put their sweat equity in it, and how happy they are when they get in the house. So then when the health changed, I had to change the things I could do more or less sitting down, less active. And that was kind of like Marilyn said, big surprise in life. I didn't plan on that. And so urging some people here in church, became a Stephen minister. And I became, as you said, Dee Dee, I've volunteered now over 9 years at a elementary school in a poverty area, helping raise money for books for children and helping them read, and ended up by de facto, I guess, being an organizer here at the church to get other people interested. And then I work at a nonprofit that our church supports. 50 churches and are involved, and a couple of synagogues, on helping working poor, no matter what their problem is. So it isn't like a welfare group. There's health services. There's somebody's car break down and they're on the edge. They can't afford the rent or something like that.
Or gas for their car.
Yeah, this group can step in, and I work there as a job counselor, helping people find better work or training. And so you can do that. All those things are kind of sitting down, which is kind of where I'm at.
Well, you go back to your statement that you made several sessions back, is everybody can do something. I love that statement, and I've used it many times. Thank you very much. But there is a sense also, when we consider the priority of time, that we give to the church. We give it willingly, and we give it from our experience and knowledge and education that no one else can give. Remember that each one of us has a specific, peculiar identity and skill sets. And so all of us can participate. And to say we should is not what you really want to say. It's or ought to. It is what we give, because we have been given so much. And the fact that we, when we go back to talking about when we joined the church, the prayer life. Now, I mentioned is the prayer time that we use, do we count that as the time? I talked to Miriam about that some time ago, and she thinks you do not count your prayer time. Tell us what you think, Miriam.
Well, I think our prayers for other people should not be on an accounting chart. I think that in our prayers, just in our communion with God is not something that you get to put in that 10% or 20% or wherever. It's a relation between you and God and you and your community, and you just do it because you're breathing the air that everybody else is. I mean, that's my opinion.
And I think that's good. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? About your time that you give? If we get it all the way down to the prayer, the presence, your gifts, and your service, do you think we should all give at least 10% of our time to the church? Or Habitat Humanity?
Or outside,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, what about just holding that up for yourself as a standard and just see where you
Where you fall.
I mean, that's a beginning.
Yeah, it's a beginning.
You know, it's not like there's some exact quantity that we've got to be sure about. I heard you breaking down the 24 hours or the 16 hours into a percentage. You know, that's like trying to decide whether
Yes,
you
of course.
you tithe off of your gross income or your net income. I mean, those kinds of calculations are not as important as just taking an assessment of yourself. How do you measure up? I think about you know, commitments that we might make in a drastic moment and say, God, if you'll get me out of this, I'll do such and such.
Oh, the foxhole.
And then the foxhole prayer, and then the time passes and you never get around to that. So we may be thinking, well, when I retire, I'll give my time to the church. But when the time gets here, you know, do you really honor that thought, or do you factor that in with the generosity with which life is treated? You know.
And I think that's a good note on which we could end this. I think that if we can give back what we have been given, even at 10%, it would be something. It would be totally amazing if we all had that attitude. Thank you all. We appreciate this. For those of you who have been watching, we invite you to comment on what we've just talked about and give us any suggestions you might want to give us. Our email address is at the bottom of the screen. And in the meanwhile, may God surround you with His grace.